Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to another panel with LLF. We're with Usman, Malik, and we're going to be introducing his book, Midnight Doorways, Fables from Pakistan, which I'm so excited to be introducing for all of you because I've been familiar with Usman's work for many years, and we worked together on the Salam Award for Speculative Fiction. But I'll just get started by doing an introduction to Usman, and we'll dive right into discussing his book, Midnight Doorways. So Usman T. Malik is a speculative fiction author based in Lahore. His short fiction has been published in magazines and books such as the Apex Book of World Sci-Fi, Nightmare, Strange Horizons, and Black Static, and in a number of years' best anthologies. He is the first Pakistani to win the Bram Stoker Award for short fiction. He has been nominated for the British Fantasy Award, the World Fantasy Award, and has twice been a finalist for the Nebula Award. He's also a co-founder of the Salam Award for Imaginative Fiction, which annually awards some of the best speculative writing from Pakistan and is currently in its fifth year. Usman is releasing on Feb 15th, Midnight Doorways, an anthology and essentially a treasure trove of fantastical, magical, and surreal stories. I've had the pleasure of reading some of these stories over the last few days, and they include stories like about being stranded by the Taliban in the ruins of a pre-Islamic city. A woman chaperoning a school trip faces ancient horrors as boys go missing and the fog rolls in. Another story is about two lovers who are set adrift amid rising floodwaters in 1960s old Lahore. And another story is about a Lahori orphanage for girls being haunted by birds and eerie visions. Usman, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful work. And thank you to the LLF for having us on this wonderful event.
Thank you so much, Noor. It's such a pleasure to be with you again and to speak on this panel.
Yeah, so let's just get started. My very first question, because we've talked about this before, is about the title of this book. We had a number. You floated a number of options with different people. At Midnight Doorways, I remember, was actually not my first choice. But after reading your stories, I understand why it's Midnight Doorways. And I want you to talk a little bit about what inspired the title of this collection.
Yeah, so, the idea of midnight would be because I tend to gravitate towards the dark in general. I do a lot of dark fiction. Mm-hmm. And doorways, because doorways are very interesting places, doorways are portals, doorways are options and opportunities, and doorways are choices. So a lot of my stories deal with human choices, involuntary or voluntary. So it kind of made sense to go with the title that would reflect it. And plus, if you put them both together, Midnight Doorways has a fantastic feel that really appeals to me. It just calls to me.
The second part of the title is about them being fables from Pakistan. So I found the use of fables interesting, particularly because fables hold a very specific meaning. There's always some, at least the traditional Aesop's fables that I grew up with, there's like a lesson to be had from fables. I wonder why you call these stories fables, or were you inspired by any particular fables when you put these works together in one collection?
So, this was a question that a friend of mine who interviewed me for Lightspeed magazine asked me, Christian Coleman. He asked me the same question. And I was, the way I look at fables is, a lot of people think of fables as moral allegories. And I think over time, I've come to realize that a fable that gives up its moral allegory quickly is no true fable. Fables are carriers, they're flame torchbearers of history. Fiction in general, that people, I believe Stephen King is famous for saying that, but I think other people before him said that too, that fiction is the light that tells the truth. And I think that's doubly truly of fables than any other art form that I'm aware of. And anytime we think of fables, we think of Aesop's fables, we think of animals speaking as humans, as that sort of an allegory. But I tend to think of fables as part, the fabulist is part of a genre of literature that is touching the boundaries of surrealism and pushes against the idea of the unreal depicting the real. So I just thought Fables seemed much better to me than calling them stories, because another reason for me to go for fables and not stories is because when we say stories in Pakistani subcontinental literature, short fiction becomes synonymous with realism, with realist fiction. And so this my stories are obviously not, they don't fall in that genre necessarily. They're really unreal or a slipstream or a genre story. I thought fables was better.
Lies that tell the truth. That's like a very, very thoughtful way to put it. I'm wondering also, you've got such a prolific writing collection. You've written for so many magazines and publications. And this is essentially your first full-fledged collection, which is just of your stories. It's not other people's work or anything like that. And so what I'm interested in knowing a bit more is about, what some of these stories have been published in other places before as well. What connects all these stories, or why did you choose to put these particular stories together? And for our viewers, I'll give a couple of examples. As mentioned before, there's a story about a Lahore orphanage. There's another story that's included in here is one that was published at Arizona State University, if I'm remembering correctly, about a city that lands on another city, in this case Lahore. And so they seem to be, on the surface, very distinct but fantastical stories. And there's a range more in there too. So could you tell me a little bit about what drew you to put this collection together? Is there a connecting thread? Did there have to be when you put it together?
Yeah, so the honest answer to that is that the connecting thread for all of these stories is pretty much me, because they are stories that I've enjoyed writing. These are stories that draw me. So they really, Ellen Datlow and a lot of other editors often talk about the idea of the anthologist, the book being a summary or a crystallization of a particular anthologist's taste. And so this is really my aesthetic taste. And so I think that in a way that unifies these stories too, that this is something that I like to do, and this represents my work over a decade. The other connecting thread is, I think that rarely do we see collections from Pakistan that tend to delve into fantastica, as this collection might, or Aisha, I'm trying to remember Aisha's last name. She wrote Jinistan. I'm trying to remember her last name, and I'm blanking on it. But she put a collection together, which is one of the other few collections that I know, that in English at least, that deal with that. So that was
Aisha
another one.
Muzaffar.
Aisha Muzaffar. Thank you. Aisha Muzaffar. I was blanking on her last name. And so Aisha Muzaffar is one of those few people who's done speculative work and who's put together collections. And for some of us who've been working in this genre for a while, we really are seeing the way these sort of stories are coming together to represent a different kind of Pakistan that we've been used to so far. And one my publisher and my designer, when we were designing the book jacket, we used the term haunted Pakistan. And Pakistan being a haunted country is with absolutely doubtless. We are haunted by memories of partition. We're haunted by traumas. We're haunted by violence. We are just coming out finally after almost 2 decades of war. So these are stories that look at Pakistan, a haunted Pakistan, through a lens that we haven't really done before, as not to my knowledge, not in English as far as I know. So I think that was the connecting thread. And at the end of the day, what connects these stories together is really my love for this kind of literature. So I like doing a range of things. I do very different tones, and I hope I do. And I think that's sort of reflected in this collection.
I agree with that. I mean, I can tell from just the variety and the really varying tones of each story that there's sort of a deep love in each story, not just for the characters but for the environment that they're that they're imbibing. There's the one in particular that I remember you told me about in advance, was The Fortune of Sparrows. So we can talk specifically about that story, which is the one set in the Lahore orphanage. And I wanted to share with our viewers that you shared this photo on Twitter recently, I not recently, but as sort of a preliminary illustration. And I can share the preliminary illustration, but I'd love for you to share with us, the way the illustration looks in the book for this particular story. And I also wanted to add that you've worked with seven or eight different artists for each story. They have a different concept. So here's the preliminary illustration for Fortune of Sparrows, which I find to be extremely haunting, extremely telling of what you can expect in the story. But also there's so many details in this photo, which once readers take a look at the story, you'll notice how the different details are reflected in the story itself. This is a girl in a mirror surrounded by, there's a very scary bird up here, and there are feathers surrounding her. But Usman, I'd love to see how the story looks now in the book in its current form.
So I'm going to share it here. I don't know how clear it is because I'm using my cell phone.
Oh, wow. It's very
so
different.
this is the final illustration. Mm-hmm. And if you read the story, then I think you'll see what's happening.
Yeah. I think that it's kind of a bit of a spoiler, frankly.
It is really a spoiler, yes.
Yeah.
And happily, we haven't talked about the story enough, so we won't be giving much away. Yeah. But Rumessa Fawad is the artist, and Rumessa was introduced to me actually on Twitter when I put out a call for artists. And, when I looked at her work, I immediately knew that she would be the right person for this story. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember why now, but it was something to do with her portfolio and her style. But she completely blew me. I mean, with even this preliminary sketch is so fantastic. It could easily have gone into the book. But with this final one, the depth and the detail of this is just crazy. I mean, anyone who looks at the book. And in fact, we do have the book right here. We have the book right here, Midnight Doorways. It's a lovely, I hope it's a lovely cover by Rohama Malik. The design is by Mushba Saeed. And the story we were referring to, that's the one.
Gorgeous. So this is interesting because it's very different. I don't have a physical copy of the book, but seeing the preliminary sketch and reading the story and now seeing the final sketch, the way you've shown it, the story itself it's about it's told from the perspective of a young girl in a Lahore orphanage, and she sees the changes happen over the years. She's reminiscing in this particular story. And Usman, you told me this earlier, but this is a very classical style compared to your other stories that sort of fall outside of what we've known reading Pakistani literature growing up. To me, this story felt like a very traditional, reminiscing story from a young girl's perspective about adults around her. Very typical Urdu literature, very typical in Urdu literature and short stories and things like that. So I want to know about how you came about this story. What inspired you, how you brought it together?
So, when I wrote this story, I was reading a lot of uncanny literature. I was reading, I was actually especially obsessed with Nayyar Masood's work. And Nayyar Saab's work, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers will know Nayyar Saab's work. He was probably the most interesting post-partition Urdu writer, of at least as far as I know. I mean, there might be others, but Nayyar really for us, because he is a writer who has done a lot of Kafkaesque sort of stories. So he's very close to my heart because of that as well. And he writes a lot of very uncanny stuff. So I was reading a lot of Nayyar Saab's work, and I was trying to see how he was pulling off his magic tricks, because his stories are very elusive. They are very difficult to decipher. They're very difficult to look at, but at all the time, that there is something else happening. There is a very famous there's a really wonderful Canadian writer, Simon Stranza, who talks about the idea of strange stories and how there are these subconscious nodes that come together and that the writer is trying to connect without the reader knowing about it. It's a very Freudian, Jungian way of approaching storytelling. And so Nayyar Saab does that a lot, in my opinion. And so when I was writing this story, I wanted it to be a very uncanny story, elusive story that would, by the end, become a little bit of a puzzle. You would wonder what was happening with the birds. You would wonder what was happening with the doorway. You would wonder, and then there is this obviously this climax, and then this denouement. And so the story really, I hope, it doesn't give itself up that quickly. It takes a couple readings, I hope. And when I was doing the story from that perspective, at the same time, I was reading a lot of Urdu poetry. I was trying to reconnect with Urdu poetry. So there is this particular paragraph in the story that Amr Hussain Saab read, and Amr commented on it. He said it kind of sounds like Urdu, someone's written Urdu in English, an Urdu piece of literature in English. And yeah, so there's definitely that traditional touch. There is Nayyar Masood in there. There is a little bit touch of Kelly Link in there as well, I think. So yeah, it became a mix, and it's one of, I don't think a writer should really say it, but I think it's one of my favorite things that I've done.
It's definitely like one of the most different things I've read out of your work, particularly because it's told through the voice of a child, and this child is trying to decipher the world around her, but it's also the voice of an adult looking back on her childhood and seeing the sort of trying to, in a subtle way, fill in the gaps of what she didn't notice as a child but knows now as an adult. And I think that that's very common in a Bildungsroman, or like in in stories like Great Expectations. But in the context of something that's so surreal and fantastical like this story, there's an additional layer of trying to decipher a mystery, because I think even the adult can't frame some of the things that they experienced or she saw as a child in that orphanage. Particularly with the birds, the doorways she goes through, the various mysterious things that she sees is something that still perplexes her as an adult. And I think that that's sort of what makes this one of the most unique stories. But also, I'm curious as to, you've been inspired a lot by Urdu literature and Urdu other Urdu short storytellers in this. But like, I wonder if you've ever encountered what was in Urdu realism, whether you were able to put what was realist and put it in a fantastical setting. Because as you've told me this before, that so much of Urdu short stories is realism. Nayyar Masood's work might be what we call surrealism. So can you talk a little bit about like that traditional mode and how you sort of try to twist that around a little bit?
So, Khalida Hussain, or Khalida Asghar, as she's been called at different times in her life, she's written a bunch of speculative stories. There's a story of her that was translated into English as The Wagon, which is actually in Jeff and Anne Vandermeer's, I believe, in The Weird as well, I think. It's either on their website or in the collection. But, so there is this tradition of, anti-real stories as well. But you're right that mostly we've seen, especially with the progressive writers and with their contemporaries, we've seen a lot of realist fiction. And I think we've been inundated by realism quite a bit in our life and in our fiction. So once in a while, it's not a bad idea to push against it. So what I really, however, I find inescapable is the idea that you and I, as children, when we walked around Lahore and we saw these dhabas and these redis and these horses and this gobar and these mirrors and these beautiful ancient ruins amidst these concrete forests, and then you look at this juxtaposition and you look at this duality, how can you not include that conflict of what was ancient and what is new? How could you not take that doorway and stand at that doorway and look in both directions? How could you not do that? And I think using a strain of fabulism or unreality with reality for Pakistan is an especially useful tool. And I hope that my stories will show folks or readers, that particular sense. And again, it is not me trying to push my version of the world, but it is me just showing them what I see.
Yeah, that's essentially the writer's job, is to show the world what they see. The world can make of it what they will. And when you talk about the new and old in Pakistan and what we saw growing up, how we see places like a city that's as massive and storied and historic as Lahore change, I find that there's a lot of there's a lot of room for richness, and your story about the city that sort of falls on top of Old Lahore and the city that's on top of the other city kind of reflects a little bit of what you're talking about, where you're essentially standing on a precipice. As we've seen, there's a really funny character, not a funny character, but a funny moment. It's funny and dark in the beginning, early on in that story, where where people are curious about what is in the other city that's landed on the city, and someone goes over and no one knows what becomes of him. It sort of becomes an emergency situation. And a great moment in there is where we are told कि घबराना नहीं है, which is still the funniest sci-fi fantasy moment I've read in a long time. But like, that is an example of sort of, it reflects to me really the rewriting of what we've seen our cities, the rewriting of our cities. And I see it in the way there's this fast-paced development of places like Beria Town and all these other sort of restructuring of Lahore, or the expansion of Lahore. And like, that story in particular spoke to me, and just telling me the ways Lahore is changing, and without even going deeply into the more like realist aspects of really the way the city's evolving and changing. But to sort of look more visually at this collection, you worked with 7 amazing artists, and if I'm not mistaken, most or all of them are women.
8 of the 9 are women.
9, okay, sorry, 9 artists. And so I'm curious as to how your collaboration worked, how you found these range of artists. Some of them are people that we know and we've encountered before. Kehkashan Khalid, who won the Salam Award last year, the year before last. There's a lot of really amazing, talented sci-fi writers and illustrators in there. So could you talk a little bit about them and how your collaboration with them worked?
Yeah, so, when I was thinking of putting the anthology together, I wanted to do this classic sort of anthology. Like, if we harken back to the times of when we were 10 years old and discovering Edgar Allan Poe and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, there was these beautiful paintings by a bunch of Victorian artists and Edwardian artists. So, I wanted to do that. So I wanted to do it in a Pakistani way. I wanted to do it in an indigenous way. So I put a call out on Twitter and I asked around, and I discovered these 9 amazing people. Kehkashan and Sania, I knew through the Salam Award. And then I realized that they were also artists. And Kehkashan, Sania, Kamal have both been, Kehkashan won the Salam Award, Sania was a finalist. So I approached them and they were delighted to be, doing art for this. Then Umar Gilani has done a lot of interesting artwork. He did the very weird, interesting illustration for The Wandering City, the story that you were talking about. It looks like a faded picture. Wonderful art. So it was just really fun collaborating with these extremely talented people, wonderful people. It was like working with a family. It didn't feel at any point like me working with other people. I could call up any of them. I could just text them, WhatsApp them, and we just had discussions back and forth. And my friend Malcolm Devlin / Vince Haig, who's a tremendous artist, won the British Fantasy Award for art some couple of years ago. I asked Vince to just kind of, because I know nothing about art. So I said, could you take a look and let me know? And he held my hand through the process. So this is a short shout out to Vince. But he was very careful. He wanted it to be a Pakistani project like we were doing. He said, I'm not going to get involved, but I'm happy to guide people if need be. And happily, not really. We didn't really need much guidance. It was mostly just on the design part. Yeah.
And Mushba Said was the person who essentially designed the whole book.
So Mushba Said was the designer extraordinaire. Rohama was the cover artist extraordinaire. And these people together with multiple, what Mushba did at the end was just way above and beyond, to the point that, well, I mean, I'm not going to talk about what we did afterwards, but it was just, she did what I could not have expected a family member to do. The way she created marketing, wow. The way she was up at 2 a.m, crazy. It was just nuts. It was like working with a little sister.
Amazing. Now, everyone in this collection is extremely talented, and I wonder, like, essentially, you gave them your short story. They interpreted it, and to see one's work interpreted through the eyes of an illustrator must be quite at risk of repeating myself, a surreal experience. because you're essentially seeing your work interpreted in another medium and you're essentially another reader's eyes. So I'm wondering how that felt for you when you saw different pieces come to life. Was it close to how you imagined, or was it better than how you imagined, or all of the above?
Pretty much in all cases, it was better than I imagined because, Samia Arif did the art for vaporization enthalpy, which is a very difficult, it's one of the more unusual and difficult pieces. Samia's interpretation was absolutely outstanding. When I saw it, I mean, my jaw dropped open. And then we have other artists Amil Hasnan's interpretation was very traditional. It was just, they were all extremely good. It felt amazing. And it felt like I had just given the story a new life by asking these people to work on it.
That's amazing. And for everyone who's watching, you really have to get the book to see all the illustrations for yourself, because reading the stories and then going back and looking at those images, it really adds an additional texture and dimension to your understanding of Usman's works. So I strongly recommend buying the physical copy of the book, getting those illustrations, flipping through them, because there's some really, really amazing talent featured in these pages, including Usman and all these amazing artists who are in the collection. So jumping to more broader questions, since I think we're close to the end of our session, but I'm very curious as to what you were reading as you put this collection together. What inspired you as you were compiling all these works? Again, these are works you've written before, but I'm sure the process of editing and rereading them, you were reading something as well to help you along the way.
Yeah, so putting a collection together is different from writing the original short story because, like you said, there have to be some thematic linkages. The order has to be in such a way that you're not tiring the reader out. You're giving them breaks. You're allowing them room to breathe. And again, here my friend Ellen Datlow's experience helped because she's been putting in. Ellen has put almost 100 anthologies together. So she often talks about her process, and I've been in touch with Ellen for a decade almost now. She was my first, I believe she was my first science fiction editor. And so I remembered what Ellen said about how you want to make sure that the first story is chunky, but it's not bulky. You want to make sure that it invites the reader in, but it's not overwhelming. And then you want to give them a little break. So I had to sort of put the order in such a way that it would feel nice. And then as the anthology went on, the size of the stories goes up a little bit. The length goes up a little bit. So it sort of builds up to this. And then at the end, you're left with this novelette, which is about 14,000 words. And kind of it becomes sort of I hope it becomes sort of a satisfying ending. So the order I had to think about. But looking back over these stories over a decade, I could absolutely see the rawness and the roughness in the initial stories. Vaporization Enthalpy, when it first came out, was a finalist for the Nebula Award. It won the Bram Stoker. But I found so much crap in it that I had to clean out. It took me a couple of days to clean out everything.
So were you reading anything else to help you, like other works?
Not really, because I am always reading something. So I was I always return to my heroes of short fiction when I need guidance. And an anthology should really be a collection should be more than the sum of its parts. So I was definitely reading Kelly Link again to see how collections were put together. I looked at Ted Chiang's collection, Exhalation and Stories of Your Life. If anyone hasn't read Ted Chiang, if you haven't read Ted Chiang, you haven't really been born yet. Really,
I agree with that.
You need to go read Ted Chiang and just discover his marvel for yourself. And again, there are tons of other people. I was reading a lot of, for the first time in my life, I was reading the Arabian Nights properly in the adult unabridged version. So it was all this conglomerate that sort of I kept going through, and I think we made it through the other side.
Wow, yeah, that's quite a collection of works. Are you working on anything else next? Can you tell us anything about your future upcoming work?
Yes, I just finished a story called Chalawa. It's Keksha Khalid actually just did a beta read for me, and so I knew she gave me some nice suggestions. So I just finished that. I just handed it off to Tor. It's coming out in November, an anthology called Dark Stars, and I'm actually finally hoping to start a novel. not start, resume it. I've written 20,000 words of a novel, and I hope to return to it, and I want to get it done by the end of this year, because my agent really is like, can you please just get that damn thing done?
That's really, really exciting. Are you allowed or comfortable to give us any hint of what the novel is about, or not yet?
I can. It's well, I mean, you never know. I might end up writing something else. But the novel is supposed to be. It's a haunted house story set in Lahore, in a house whose rooms change. So that's all. That's all I will say for now.
It's very Harry Potter-like in a way. Or yeah, and then that's actually I'm gonna be waiting with bated breath for that story, because I'm excited to see where it goes. So I guess just to sort of wrap up, I think we only have a couple of minutes left. I'm wondering what words of advice you have for people who are generally sort of struggling through this pandemic. It's been a very, very difficult year. Well, more than a year now, 2020 and now 2021. We're still going through the pandemic. You're a doctor as well, as in addition to being a writer. So you've sort of seen a range of experiences when it comes to creative life and professional life as well. So how has your year been in terms of sustaining yourself creatively, and what advice would you give to people who are, say, struggling during this time?
So, everyone's struggles are going to be very different. I think my best piece of, the advice that I think is most important for folks is, if given the choice between staying at home and reading a book versus going out to a wedding, choose the former. Because I just heard back from the group, the Corona group, the COVID group in Punjab. Just today at Mayo Hospital, they're seeing increased cases again. So the new variant from the UK might at any point reach Pakistan, and the infectivity is much higher. So I would just tell people, please stay as the simplest thing you can do to protect all of us is just at least mask up. Please just mask up. And that will solve about 40-50% of our problems. And then anything that sustains you, don't care about other people, don't worry about peer pressure. Anything that sustains you, don't worry about judgment. It can be books, it can be art, it can be music, it can be a walk in the park. Walks in the park are safe, outdoors. Do it. Think of yourself first and your family members first, and everything else is secondary.
On that same note, do you think that, are we ready for a collection of fantastical work around surrounding a pandemic, or do you think it's too soon for that?
It's already happening. The tons of literature and art is going to come out of the pandemic. It's already started. The New York Times did a Decameron project, which featured a lot of science fiction and realist stories. Jo Walton did a new Decameron project on her Patreon. So we're going to see pandemic. The literature is going to become saturated by the pandemic for at least a decade. So the trick for aspiring writers is going to be careful. My friend Vince Haig, I wrote a Pitchell Perry story recently, and Vince Haig read that, and Vince said, Usman, don't anchor it to the pandemic. Otherwise, the story will become dated very quickly. And he was correct. So I went back and I cleaned it out, and I made sure that it wasn't dated to this particular pandemic.
That's really interesting, because I'm actually avoiding reading pandemic stories, at least in terms of art. Like, I'm happy to read articles, but artwork, I don't know. Like, I feel like many people will feel differently about this, but personally, it's very hard to read dated stories when you're living them. So thank you so much, Usman. I think we're just about out of time. I think we only have this much time for the panel, but I will say that look out for Midnight Doorways, Fables from Pakistan. Usman, if you want to hold it up again, that'd be great.
Oh, sure.
I'm trying to be a good, panel person.
That's the book. As you can see, It's a little shiny.
It's beautiful.
I like that little shiny thing.
Who is the cover by again?
Rohama Malik. And the design is by Mushbat Saeed.
Yes.
And we've got Karen Joy Fowler blurbing the book, which makes me very happy.
Yay. So Midnight Doorways, it's out February 15th, if I'm correct?
That's correct.
Yes.
I just received the first 100 copies today from the printer, which I'm going to be distributing soon.
Amazing. And it's available at major bookstores in Lahore. I think the last
So
one.
last word, Liberty Books and Books and Beans, which is
Wonderful.
Vanguard, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah. And you can also order it online if you're not sitting in Lahore, on Usman's website, usmanmalik.com. You can order it there. And yeah, it's a fantastic collection. Usman's work is available online. I'm so excited that exists out there. We need more works like this. And yeah, please everyone get a copy of the book, support local Pakistani writing, stay home and read a book. Thank you again.
Take care, guys. Thank you, LLF.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Noor.